Welcome and thank you so much for joining us for tonight for this new session of Artist Think Tank. As a general reminder, we provide this space very intentionally for AAPI artists to join together in community, to learn, to share, to grow, to network, and then also to get a bit of coaching as well. It's something that, between myself and the other board members, we do this because we're really passionate about helping other folks along the way. If there's a bit of wisdom that we can share, or if you have wisdom and experience that you'd like to share with others, that's exactly what this space is for. Now, tonight's session is called Making an Impact That Lasts. And I've been wanting to do this for some time because I want artists to really think about this idea of sustainability. It doesn't really matter what medium you choose, whether it's film or music, dance, writing, visual art, etc. A lot of the larger processes, the mental strategies and way of framing things are largely the same. So I want to focus a bit on that. And so as we kind of dive in a little bit more, I'd like to take a moment to really ask ourselves, what do we mean by these words when we say impact or things that last? So the first one is, we can actually define impact in a couple of different ways, especially when it comes to the arts. For those of us who are artist activists, we tend to think of impact as being able to make an effect on changing the culture, or especially on attitudes and behaviors of people. So artists who want to highlight, say, sexism or racism or transphobia or other issues that are really important, climate justice, etc. This is a way for us to build a platform and to get a message across in order to change some of those things. Beyond that, you can even take it a step further and think how do we change systems? How do we change the entire structure of what exists out there in order to create some kind of impact? I think impact is also really important to look at in terms of oneself as well, which is also why I indicate transforming oneself or having that personal growth. And that can come from healing or expression. These are all really important because as artists express themselves, their audiences can oftentimes find healing for themselves as well. In particular, when a certain story or something about the work resonates with those who hear it and experience it. And of course, you can't talk about impact without talking about the market or the kind of commercial viability of art, because whether we like it or not, that's a part of this world as well. So a lot of times people will measure impact by accolades received. Did you get a Grammy? Did you get a gold or platinum album? How many sales have you had in terms of your book? What's your reach in terms of your artwork? How many people attended that theater performance? These are all measured because it kind of demonstrates a certain commercial sustainability, which could impact your potential revenue and also additional opportunities that you have in the future. But I want to really emphasize this because however you slice it, and maybe multiple of these things apply to you, you should, at the end of the day, measure what you value. You don't value what is measured. In other words, don't put stock necessarily in the things that only serve the ego or vanity metrics, like sales or social media following or things like that. You should really be focusing on measuring the things that matter the most. Are they getting you closer to your goal? Is it the kind of work that you wish to produce? And when you think about if you're the future cast, you think about where you are in 10, 20, 50 years, and you're kind of reflecting back on your life, think about what would matter to you most then. That's the stuff that you should be measuring. Are you getting to that, closer to that point where you can envision yourself being really satisfied with the kind of career you have? So impact can be seen in many different ways. And I think it's really important to examine that in particular, because we talk about it all the time, but we seldomly break it down. And we'll go into a little more detail about this in just a minute. But the other part I want to talk about is that sustainability portion. What does it mean to last? You might think of it as to have the final word, the final say in something. A lot of us think about it in terms of having your work beyond your lifetime, to have that impact lasting so that people continue to pick up that work of art and engage with it, or that you can walk away or retire or whatever, when you're done with your particular career, see how it changed the culture in a significant way, in a way that matters to you and the other people that you want to impact. For other people, it means to have a legacy, to be remembered. But there's also lasting in the moment, and that is to be self-sustaining, have enough resources so that you can continue making art and not only like survive, but that you can actually thrive while making art. And, you don't want to just be like last, you want to actually be in a part of your career where you can continue to last. So in this particular definition, as we're like thinking about what we mean, I want you to really prioritize the journey over the destination. Because oftentimes we'll say like, oh, I'm going to be satisfied when I hit this particular milestone in my career. And for many artists, in fact, almost every artist that I know, when they hit that milestone, they're seldomly satisfied because they're on to the next milestone. They're on to the next thing. You might be happy about like, oh, I'm gonna, have this gold record and I'll be happy. I'm gonna hit #1 on the Billboard charts. But what happens when you release more music and then you get a #2 or #10? Oftentimes there's a certain resentment or discouragement because we haven't really like thought about where we want to see the journey and what that day-to-day looks like. So let's dive into these concepts a little bit more. So I really want to talk about making an impact. And again, impact can be measured in a couple different ways. So let's talk about some of those impact areas and what that can actually look like and how you might start thinking about it when it comes to your own career as well. So again, that question, what kind of impact do you want to make? What is it that you hope to change? What is it that you hope to shift? Because like really, that's what an impact is, right? It's a collision point. It's a catalyst. It's something that causes change in society, in your career, in the world, however you want to define it. But start thinking what kind of impact you want to make. Now, again, for some, it's that validation piece, that prestige. And there's nothing wrong with this. This is the traditional arts career. Like if you remove that activism piece from it and people just want to have art, and making art is definitely important for many different reasons. But when you think about what it means to create a film that has an impact or to make an album that has an impact, oftentimes you're going to be reliant on gatekeepers and other people who kind of decide if you get distribution or if other people get access to your work. So in many ways, when you start thinking about who it is you're trying to impact, it might be a gatekeeper. It might be a studio to decide if that film is going to get greenlit. It might be a music critic to decide if your work is going to get reviewed, or someone who curates playlists, and if someone who just books talent for the theater or venue. So your audience might be those fans you're trying to reach, but there's someone that might be standing in the way. And when you think like, okay, we have to move that person first, that might actually shift how you approach either the work itself or how you market that work or communicate it with other people. Measuring prestige also comes with like commercial metrics. So in nearly every single genre of art there's some kind of commercial metric that people use. In music, it's going to be album sales and downloads. In traditional fine art, it's going to be the gallery price and auction price. In film, it's going to be the box office. In the world of literature and writing, it's going to be placements in terms of journals if you're doing short pieces, and it's going to be sales of a book. And all of these things are oftentimes will come with like a Nielsen reporting or SoundScan or something that determines what those metrics will be. And if you want to like make an impact in those areas, you better believe like you should be tracking that success there. It's important to note that in none of those industries does having a large social media following impact those kind of commercial viability metrics. And none of those do they really factor in like having a viral video or viral piece of content, unless the viral content or those followers can be leveraged to turn into sales, into things that actually push the things that those gatekeepers care about. So, and a lot of times those the focus on that prestige piece is like focusing on like making a splash point. It's not necessarily that slow and steady building career. It is a career that can like make an immediate like splash that catches folks' attention. Maybe it's the media. It's definitely has to do with the marketplace and what people traditionally think of like this is what a successful artist looks like. The benefit to this, of course, like in choosing this particular path or having this metric or being successful in this area is that it can oftentimes inspire change in surprising ways. It can open the doors for other people. You know, we know the film Crazy Rich Asians was kind of like, it was a big bet for a lot of people. But the reason why certain investors like Gold House and other philanthropists in the Asian American scene put so much money into the film to the point where they would actually buy out entire theaters all across the country during opening weekend is because they wanted to make such a big splash that Hollywood would see Asian American led films as a viable thing that could happen. The reason why so many Asian American bloggers and entertainment writers covered Fresh Off the Boat back when it made its appearance on television like a decade ago was for that same reason. And it's the same reason why you will get curated lists of like writers of color and playlists of like music on Spotify during Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. Like, because people know that if a few people are successful, it makes the path easier for those that follow. Now, changing oneself is definitely a really important thing that one should consider in terms of making an impact as well. And when you're prioritizing this as the kind of impact that you want to make, like if you're making art to change yourself or impact your own world or to express something like deep within, then you have to absolutely prioritize self-care and self-awareness. The irony, of course, is that oftentimes the artists that are creating work that they're using to try and impact their own world or like to go through some internal process, oftentimes self-care and self-awareness are one of the last things that they think about. And so I really want to use this as a reminder to say, like, if this is the change that you really want to create, then you should absolutely be making sure that you build this in as part of your process, build this in terms of like some of the metrics that you're considering so that you can actually have a sustainable arts career. And so if your impact, the way you think about your journey, well, then the way to think about it is that that mountaintop is a trip for one. You don't necessarily have to bring a ton of other people along. Like if that trip is for one, then you have to think about like, what is the stuff that's going to move your soul the most? The thing that makes you feel most fulfilled, not necessarily what sells the most or not necessarily what is able to influence the culture, because you're really about shifting something from within. And so the great thing about this kind of approach is that you can empower other people simply through self-discovery and expression, because there's going to be other travelers of this life who feel like your story resonates with them, who identify with your work because they're going along in this process as well. I mean, how many of us as artists have been moved because of some other artist's work? Because we've seen an important film or listened to an album that just changed our life, or read a book that inspired us to pick up a pencil or to start typing. Like, it's really, really powerful, but we have to think like this is also a different kind of mentality. It's a different kind of approach. And so if you have a call to action, that call to action should always be growth. Is this stretching me as an artist? Is this, are the things that I'm doing forcing me to challenge myself, to take risks, to make better art? Now, you can also think about not only changing oneself, but like changing systems. So this is something that was a really big priority for myself when I was leading the Slants. And when you talk about like changing systems, oftentimes you'll want to think about that framework in what's called a hero's journey. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you just want to see yourself as a hero figure or anything like that, but it's more like the process that you undergo. So in like all mythology, all storytelling, there's a framework called the hero's journey. And it basically is defined by that protagonist, or the aka hero of the story. They have to go through and endure certain things in order to create this bigger lasting change. And that change or that end goal is oftentimes much bigger than themselves. So when you think about like the classic example of a hero's journey story to a T would be Star Wars, especially A New Hope. You know, Luke Skywalker begins and he gets called to something greater than himself and ends up making that bigger splash. But along the way, he has to pick up things like mentors, and he has to figure out what his actual opposition is, both within and without. And so we think about like changing a system, it's much greater than this. That means like changing the government, it means changing the laws, it means changing the way business is done in terms of an industry or a company or a community. When you think about this, you want to map out your goals. What's first and foremost is not necessarily the art in of itself. It is the change that you wish to seek, the mission. That is the most important thing. And that gets prioritized oftentimes higher than the art, which is tough to grapple with as artists, but it's really important to understand. And this kind of change is seldomly done alone. Like you have to work within a community, and that means organizations, businesses, other change agents, and that sort of thing. And it also means that the tools that you pick up for this kind of journey will oftentimes look very different than what it would look like, say, for someone else pursuing a traditional arts career. So in the case of my band, we wanted to change systems. And one of those changes that we became very well known for doing was changing law, and that law had to do with around freedom of expression. And so some of the tools that we used and some of the paths we took looked very different than any other artist would take. Like, for example, me going to law schools and booking events like talking to judges, and some of those tools that we use had to do more in the realm of advocacy, and yet that still went hand in hand with the art as an artist activist. It just prioritized the change first and foremost. So the other thing to think about is that that change or the mission will likely outlast the art itself, which is in a way kind of how we got to the Slants Foundation. We started thinking, what is that larger impact that we seek to make? Is it just like playing rock and roll tours and that kind of thing, as much fun as we have there? Or is it empowering our community, like providing pathways for other artists to pop up and create change? Ultimately, it became about the latter, which is why we decided to, go down this path of starting our own nonprofit organization. Now, maybe you don't necessarily want to like topple over the government or like some archaic law. Maybe you want to change the culture, like attitudes that people have about our community or about other communities. And so this is an example of like changing the culture. So this year we helped launch this album from two rappers, Jason Chu and Alan Z. It's called the Face Value Project. And basically every song on this album wraps its way through iconic moments in Asian American history, and it also tackles Asian American issues. We wanted to work with them to create this album. We were the fiscal sponsors, and I helped coach them and provided input in a couple of different ways of like launching this album, because we wanted to change the culture around anti-Asian racism. Now, the first single got released in May, and then the album took off. It became one of the top curated albums on Spotify and hip hop for the month. So it's definitely had an artistic merit and artistic changes there, but we also wanted to like create bigger changes beyond just what the album was doing, which is why we're now working to get into phase 2 and 3 of this particular album, which is creating curriculum for K through 12 classrooms and college classrooms so that people can dive into that Asian American history, those hidden stories, while using this art, using this album as its cultural point of relevance that folks could dive into. It's the same kind of approach that the musical Hamilton took. Like Hamilton, yes, it absolutely is its own work of art, amazing music, it's a theatrical piece, it's extremely moving, but inspired so much more. And it's one of the most discussed items in social studies classrooms around the country, because it's inspiring people to approach the culture in a very different way. So when this becomes your aim, again, just like changing systems, you'll want to work with a community. You want organizations to be helping you out, keeping you accountable. You probably want businesses to help invest in the product. And you also want to work with agents of change. In the case of the Face Value Project, the rappers worked with us as that fiscal sponsor to help them get arts grants. We worked with other advocacy organizations to talk about the message. They featured many different artists, comedians, actors, and other folks like Dante Bosco, Ronnie Chang. They had AJ Raphael, like a lot of different artists appeared on the album as well. So it became a very collaborative effort. And also because they want to make it more, have greater representation when it came to the APA community. It's just looking beyond just the artists themselves. And of course, the mission is integrated in the art. It isn't necessarily like prioritized higher than the art. It's definitely a part of it because you want to make sure every bit of that art speaks to that mission. And it oftentimes involves reimagining what the work looks like. So an example with like Face Value, it's like we're changing the systems. We want to change culture and education. So maybe what does it look like to tour classrooms or to work with teachers? What does it look like to do Zoom calls with students to talk about rap music as a way to bring stories out? The impact is primary. The validation, all the good stuff that you get, like features and playlists and album sales and follows, that's secondary because ultimately the focus is on like, how can I change the culture? The great thing is like when you're changing the culture, all that other stuff that people think of as vanity metrics or validation, that will oftentimes follow as a result of changing the culture. It's very seldom that's the other way around. Like when you're trying to cultivate followers or influence a community or that sort of thing, it's very difficult to create change if that's not your primary focus. I think it's important to remind folks that making art is not selfish. So no matter what your end goal is, whether it's to like sell a ton of albums and books and films and tickets and everything like that, or it's to change entire cultures and systems, whatever you do, like self-expression is not selfish. And choosing this path as a viable career, as one where you get paid, where you get money from your friends and family and community, it is not selfish. Creating art is an act of generosity. It's tapping into something that's bigger than yourself, even if it comes from within. So definitely important to keep in mind. Now let's talk about like what it is if once you have that idea of like making impact in mind, like one way of visualizing how to get to that destination, especially if that destination might be a little bit unclear for some of you, like I oftentimes like to envision it as a physical thing. And so a number of years ago, Neil Gaiman kind of gave this commencement speech that I thought was really powerful. And he says like, if you want to dive into the world of art, you should really think about your goal as a mountain. And as you kind of go through your journey of life, you should think every day with every decision, are you getting closer to the mountain or are you getting further from the mountain? If it is this destination in the distance, what are the things you're investing in or choosing to do with your time, your energy, your focus? Are they getting you closer to that mountain? And if not, then you should be really rethink that particular choice. So for example, if, in that commencement speech, Neil Gaiman was talking about how you really want to be a writer, but not just any kind of writer. He wanted to write fantasy and science fiction, and he wanted to bring these fantastical stories to life. Well, along his way, he actually got a very lucrative job offer writing for a column, like a sports column. Now, I could have said like, well, that's going to give me a platform. It's going to give me income. I can still write on the side and do that for fun. But at the end of the day, he turned down the job opportunity because he says it would take him further away from that mountain. And he decided to just double down, take the riskier approach by continuing to choose that path because he wanted to make those decisions that got him closer to that goal of like producing fantasy. Ultimately, it worked out really, really well for him. He's just like wealthy beyond any of our imaginations, and he's producing immense works of art that are doing really cool and important things. But like, this is just a great example to think about, like, what is your mountain? And if you are thinking about that mountain, if you're thinking about like undergoing this journey of art, you can start thinking about like, what does it take to get to a mountain or to scale a mountain? And so I want you to think about like preparing for a journey that lasts. We talk about making an impact. I want to talk about lasting impact. And in order to have a lasting impact, truly, you want to have a career that lasts. You want to have a sustainable arts career. And so think about like your kind of packing list. This is like very, very similar to like what it would take if you wanted to make a plan to, scale Mount Everest or something like that, or even just to, go on a ski trip. You want to think about the relationships that you want to take along with you. Who are you surrounded by? Who are you going to take with on this journey? You want to think about like what kind of tools that you need to pack. What do you need to take with you? Like the physical things or software or things that help you get there. You want to think about the resources like food and fuel so that you can actually continue to make that journey in a sustainable way. You want to bring along a map to guide you along. And then you should probably also have an itinerary, an idea of the amount of time it takes and what you're going to do with that time. So let's break this down in terms of your arts career. Number one, you want to think about those relationships. It's very hard to achieve impact in the world of art as a singular person. Like you might be this guitarist here just wailing on stage, like ripping into this incredible solo, but I guarantee you it would sound a lot less impressive if this guitarist didn't have a band backing him. Like if there was no sound person, if there's no one to do lights or to like roll out that fog, or no one to like hook up any sound to that amplifier so that the audience could hear it, they would just be quietly like piddling on stage by themselves without anyone actually noticing that they're there. In the same kind of way, oftentimes our team will look different depending on the kind of work that we do. If you're a writer, that you probably are going to be working with an editor, a book jacket designer, a book packager, a marketing team, a book publicist. If you're in a band, not only the other musicians, but production, audio engineering. You're probably going to be working with somebody to distribute that album, even if it's a piece of software or nameless face, like if you're working with CD Baby or TuneCore or something like that. But getting on stage will involve other people inevitably. Same thing with film and dance and so on. Like you got to think about those kinds of roles, both on stage, like the visible, obvious ones, as well as those off stage and the less visible ones. For example, the friends and family that we have around us, are they truly supportive and on board with that goal or not? You want to think about the tools, and tools are really important to think about because oftentimes as consumers, as artists, as people in this kind of like materialistic world, we oftentimes lose focus between what is absolutely necessary and what would be nice to have. I know this is a huge issue in the world of musicians. Almost every musician I work with, they want to have the best gear possible. They're like, oh my goodness, if I had this amp, my life would be significantly better. And at the end of the day, the audience probably wouldn't know the difference between one amp over another, or one guitar over another, or a particular drum head, and so on. In terms of like filming equipment, in terms of like what you use to write, like think about what is absolutely necessary and what is nice to have, because resource allocation is a big thing when it comes to making your career sustainable. And that is important to think about, like resources. How will you be sustained? How are you going to put food on the table, pay for those bills, especially the reoccurring ones, not only for the making of art, but also for like your regular bills, like rent and food and that sort of thing. So when you start planning for this journey, it is important to think about revenue streams and ways of generating income. It's not just like making a splash in terms of like, oh, I'm going to do work that catches a lot of people's attention. You got to be thinking, how do I engage with a way where I'm giving them so much value that these people are going to continue to choose to invest in my art, paying for my work, paying for me to show up, or how can I take my skills and talents that are steeped in my art and make them accessible in other ways so that I can drive revenue in. For example, if your music career is such at a point where you're not necessarily selling enough tickets or merchandise to bring in an income, maybe you can use the same skills and talent to teach music lessons. Or if you're a writer, maybe you can be a freelance editor and so on. Like these are all other ways of thinking about like making sustainable art. Of course, it's really important to to have a map, a clear sense of where you are going, how are you going to get there, and of course that itinerary, like the what questions. What are you going to do, and most importantly, when are you going to do those things, and when are you going to do them by? So taking inventory of all these different important assets, your packing list, I want you to think about, like, am I actually renting my career or am I owning my career? Choosing either path is, there's no right or wrong, but it's going to give you a different mindset, because if you're pursuing this art as a hobby, that's going to look very differently than if you're going to pursue this as a sustainable career. And I oftentimes like to use illustrations that come from other worlds, because they put our work in a different kind of context. And so let's talk about that owner versus renter approach to the arts. A renter tends to have a finite mindset, right? You're just there temporarily. You never know when you're going to move. Maybe your lease is going to be running out, and that's when you can think about if you want to stay or not. Renters will spend resources. They will take money and they will spend it. They will do things just to patch things up so that it keeps going another day. They will have no equity. You don't have no ownership of those assets. So when you have a renter mindset, your things aren't providing continual lasting value. And renters deflect responsibility, right? We know what happens if your garbage disposal breaks in your apartment. You call the super, you call the landlord, you call the person that owns it to come and fix it. What happens if you rent a car and like the brake pads go out? You call the rental car company. You have them take care of it. Well, owners, of course, have a different mindset, right? You have to think of more of an infinite mindset, because all of a sudden you're not spending your resources, you're investing your resources. You don't just patch things up temporarily unless that's all you can afford. What you're really looking to do is to fix things, because you want things to last. You don't just build for the moment. You want to build in a way that continues to endure, so that you don't have to keep spending your resources on patchwork things. Your long-term solutions that's what you care about. So like, for example, like a rental mindset of, like, say, merchandise for a musician would be like, okay, I have enough I'm just going to buy enough to get through this one tour. I'm going to buy, like, 48 t-shirts, because that's a standard minimum. An owner mindset might be thinking like, okay, I'm going to be going on multiple tours. And even though it's more money up front, what I'm going to do is invest in multiple types of merchandise that I know will do well, so that I can get the per unit price down, so that I can get more sustaining income over the long run. Or I'm going to change to a drop shipping model. So instead of spending my time packaging goods every single time, I'm going to let another company do it. I might make less money, but I will have more time to work on other parts of my business or other parts of my art. So just a very different mindset. And that also means that you, again, have to take responsibility, but more importantly, you develop assets. You think about those long-term things that can provide a return on investment. It's the same reason why you want to buy a house versus just renting a property, if you're looking to increase your wealth and to develop assets. So imagine, let's bring this into a completely different industry. Like, imagine you want to open a food truck, right? You start thinking about these exact same 5 areas in your packing list into this. You might think about, like, okay, team, who's going to be serving, who's going to be cooking up the food. You want to think about the tools, like, okay, these are the necessary items to have in my kitchen. I need a folding, I need to be able to fit in this finite space. I only have so much money to work with, so I'm going to invest in what I absolutely need. And if things go well, I can get that fancier stove or that fancier truck, maybe a new food truck as opposed to like a used one. You want to think about those resources, because you're constantly thinking, what can I do to make it month to month, but at the same time, like, build more resources so that I can invest more into this business. How can I have enough to make sure my staff get paid and that I can eat? Your map would be like your physical location. Like, where are those audiences going to be? Where are my customers? Where do I need to show up? How do I get there? And then your itinerary. When do I show up? How often do I need to prepare food? When do I need to do that? What are my operating hours, etc.? And if you have a particular goal, let's say you say like, you know what, my goal is to make $50,000 profit in my first year, then you could say, well, let's break that down. That means I need to make, $6,000 or a little bit over $44,000 a month to get there. $5,000 a month to get 60K. So yeah, a little bit over 4K. That means I need to make at least about $1,000 a week to get to $50,000. And you start thinking about how you can fine tune the process so you can get a lower cost of goods down. Like these are all things that you're thinking about in order to like have that owner operator mindset, right? But if you were to like take the same approach to somebody's arts career, oftentimes we're not thinking about those things. We're doing it backwards. So here's an example of doing things wrong when it comes to like the food truck. Like what would be wrong? Thinking about fans, thinking about how you can grow your social media influence in your audience before you think about the product. Or choosing to cook only when you feel inspired. How ridiculous is that? If you're opening a restaurant, you got to cook every single day. And not only does it increase your skill set, but it's because that is the work that you chose. Same thing with making art. Like I know a lot of artists, a lot of musicians, a lot of writers, they wait until they feel inspired. They wait for the muse. They wait until they feel like that rush of inspiration. But there's a very different mindset, which just means like you're choosing to make a practice. And that means showing up whether you feel like it or not, showing up and doing the work whether you feel inspired or not. And what you find from showing up is that the inspiration, that feeling, the muse, it tends to speak louder and more clearly when you show up consistently to do the work. And the other part of this is like, if you're investing into this business, like of course, income and sustainability is like, you're thinking about that every single day because you're like, can I afford food to cook and sell? Well, the same thing with your arts career. You got to be thinking like, what is my sources or the source or multiple sources of income? And how can I do things where I'm not just going from gig to gig or from project to project? How can I develop assets where it creates value on a regular basis so that my career can be sustainable? So I know there's a lot to cover here, but let's talk about like what this could actually look like in your arts career for each of these tools. Relationships, like number one, you should start rethinking relationships. One way of doing this is thinking about creating an advisory board for your art. This means like having a group of people who could provide input, maybe inspiration into all aspects of your art, not just like the creation and production of like music or literary piece, but people who could advise you on the business aspect, the finances, people who would advise you in terms of marketing, communications, and so on. You would be very well advised to have this input, especially those outside of your experience in your normal circle, because you want people to look at your work with an objective view. If you're going to have something like this, I would say schedule meetings in advance. So if the commitment for your advisory board is like, you know what, can we check in once a quarter? Let's get these dates on the calendar. Make sure they prioritize those dates in advance. Schedule them out for the entire year. Make sure people will prioritize that time, because that's how you can make sure that they show up. They're making that commitment. They need to be held accountable to that as well. You should have a shared agreement in advance on what your impact and what your goals are going to be. If people are providing input to your work, they need to know what is the change that you seek to create. That way they can speak to that. And you should celebrate failures. Anyone who's providing input in your life, into your career, should be saying like, are you trying new things? Are you taking risks? And are you failing forward? Like learning lessons along the way. And if you try something out and it doesn't work out, people should celebrate that, because that's a lesson learned. That's a valuable piece of education, instead of like dwelling in feelings of negativity, because when that happens, we tend to become risk adverse and start minimizing those important decisions that we need to make. When you think about relationships, you also want to network like a champ. Like you should be thinking about genuine collaboration and have a service mindset. How can I serve other people? The other day I was meeting someone here in Cincinnati. He's the executive director of the Cincinnati Music Accelerator. And I was talking about this music conference that I'm helping organize. And I just kept asking, like, well, what can I do for your organization? What are your needs? How can I help you out? And at the end of the day, when he's just like, what is it that you wanted to meet me for? And I was like, well, like, yeah, I'm doing this thing. It'd be really cool if you want to be involved with it. But really, like, I want to talk about like how we can work together. And it was really interesting because he said he wanted to join my steering committee. He wanted to commit, like, it's a pretty big commitment, but he wanted it right then and there. He says, because like almost every meeting he takes like at least 10 meetings a day. He's like, people always ask to meet me and talk about partnership and want to work together. But he's like, most of the time it's just them talking about themselves and their needs and what they want from me. He's like, almost nobody asks me like what they can do for me. And he's like, you started out that way. So I didn't need to hear what it is you wanted. I already knew that you had the right kind of spirit, and that's the kind of person I want to work with. So when you think about like approaching relationships, whether it's someone you want to get in touch with, say for coaching advice or investing in your career or working with you, continue to find ways to like think about like what it is that motivates them and how you can serve those needs. Because I guarantee you, the more that you can help other people and meet their goals and get what they want, the more that they'll be willing to help what you want. The other part of this is showing up consistently as well. I mean, just making sure that your presence is always seen and heard. Back when I was in Portland, Oregon, I made it a point to do this. Like, I was at fundraisers and community events at least 3 or 4 nights a week. I was constantly showing up, part because it was like my job to, as someone who was serving on nonprofit boards, but in part because I also wanted to see who was showing up, who was doing the work. And it got to a point where every senator, every congressman, the mayor, they all were like, who's this guy, this Asian dude who shows up on everything? Like, and it, every time I re-met them, because I met a lot of them many times, I'd be like, oh, hey, my name is Simon. They're like, we know who you are. You're like always around. But it got to a point where they knew that I could be consistently relied upon. So that's why they would turn to me or the organizations I was working with to help develop policy. Like, okay, what can we do to develop environmental policy in a way that makes sense for multiple communities? We know you work in those areas, and because you show up all the time, we know you're invested into the work we're doing. That's what showing up demonstrates. It's a way of proving yourself that you care enough to show up. It also means like being more diverse in your team when you think about relationships, like not just in terms of representation, but what kinds of skills are needed and how can you recruit folks to provide those skills or inputs that you need, and to redefine what's possible when it comes to like collaborating with artists. So there's this thing out, a lot of communities, they call it having a susu. I don't know if you're familiar with this thing, but it's in a lot of economically challenged neighborhoods, people will create what's called a susu. And what a susu is like a tight-knit group that chooses to invest together, and they share that investment. So for example, someone might create a susu by developing a collaborative with 12 other friends or family or neighbors. And so there's 13 people in this group. And what happens is every paycheck, everybody in that group will commit to putting $100 into like a pot. And every single week, one person draws out that entire pot. You determine an order, and that's how you know you'll get that windfall. And what's cool about this is like, you're not necessarily gaining interest on this thing, but you know that every 13 weeks, you're gonna get $1,300. And it becomes a fun community-based kind of thing because people are invested in each other. They're accountable to each other. And if anyone misses a payment, generally speaking, you get kicked out of the susu, you don't get that windfall. But like, oftentimes, like whether it's like $1,300 or say $13,000, it's hard for us to just imagine pulling together those funds immediately. But we can break it up in little pieces. And what's cool is that that little piece can impact somebody else's career, their living situation, maybe something they want in a really dramatic way. And when it comes around back to you, you can use that windfall effect and to really make some dramatic decisions as well. So whether it's money or maybe social media or maybe sharing a list or opportunities when it comes to performances, like you can think about a susu and that kind of mindset in any kind of way. So if you're collaborating with other artists, how can I do it in a way that allows everybody to benefit, even if it's, we each got to wait our turn. But when we do wait our turn, the impact is so much greater. So you can also think about like, rethinking like what's possible in collaboration in terms of like a feature or like what a band means, who gets to show up on my album, who gets to have an excerpt in my book, who gets to have a speaking role or a visual role in a film, and how can I return that to other people. We talk about the tools, like I want to talk about like transforming the idea of tools. So again, we want to prioritize what we actually need and only take what is necessary. Your money and your time should only be spent on the most important things, because those are the two most important tools that you have when it comes to creating art. You think about, will the tools or will the way I spend my money or my time, will that actually make a difference for my goal? Again, is it getting me closer to that mountain or not? Sometimes it means thinking about your process in a way that is unconventional. And that might mean changing your perspective. It might mean asking yourself, what would things look like if it were easy? And detailing out the process of what that would be like. And then figuring out like, okay, maybe I can take some of that mindset and apply it to my particular situation right now. Or it might mean like, this particular tool is really expensive. Can I just create something that does the same kind of thing, that serves the same end goal? If you're struggling with capacity, like and not having enough time in the day, you might think about a tool that is extremely important, but not really expensive, as a calendar and project management. How can I structure my schedule in a way where I could prioritize my art? And do I need to adjust those tools in order to be destination focused? So, one of the first things that I ask when I talk to artists, when I'm coaching them in their careers, is like, how much time are you spending? And like, do you have an extra 15 minutes a day? If you can dedicate an extra 15 minutes every single day, you just bought yourself 90 hours a year. If you can commit to 30 minutes a day, maybe that means like 30 minutes less on Netflix or Hulu or something like that. You just got yourself 180 hours a year that you can now dedicate towards your art. And then so you think about like prioritizing that time and then building everything else around it. Again, making that first, choosing your art first, and things that support that art, and then everything else falling behind it. That could be a way of restructuring an existing tool that you might have, but in a way that makes it more efficient. So you think about like other kinds of resources or your money, because you want to think about like having a sustainable career, and that, for better or worse, involves capital. There are other ways to think about this as well. So, and whether it's an arts career or a business, there's only two ways of increasing your revenue. One is increasing profit, so that means like selling more, or two is cutting expenses. And the same can go for time, by the way. You can choose to reallocate time, just like I just mentioned, but same thing with like this kind of thing. So for example, this is another thing that I bring up with a lot of performing artists, people who want to like be on stage for a living, whether it's especially touring musicians. I'm always like, your number one expense almost always will be your mortgage or your rent. So why not decrease that? So like, why live in a really expensive place like New York City or Nashville or San Francisco or Seattle, when you can move to the Midwest, buy a house for $100,000 where your house payment's $400 a month, build an asset that's actually generating wealth, and you can actually build your own recording studio. Again, building your own tools to make it happen, especially because you don't necessarily need to be on these traditional music cities anymore when you don't want to overplay them anyway. I oftentimes, I live in Cincinnati, Ohio. I might always make the case for it because I'm like, listen, 50% of the US population lives within 500 miles of me. If you want to have a sustaining tour, like you can do that here in a way that's much more difficult when you're on those outer coasts, because it's much more difficult to get to New York if you're in LA, or to Atlanta if you're in Seattle. Like think about like centralized locations that could cut all those expenses so that you can actually have a sustainable career, because all of a sudden you don't need as much money, and the money that comes in can go a lot further. You might also think about your revenue in terms of like your product, whatever that your product might be, music, writing, film, etc. How can you use what's existing to generate more money? Maybe it's licensing it out so other people can use it. Maybe it's like you want to be giving out like free samples like at Costco, which would be like giving out samplers of your work, like getting excerpts published in other places that direct them to the larger body of work. Maybe it's changing your relationship with your supporters so you can go into crowdsourcing or Patreon, where you have a regular call to action. There's that expectation built in that they support your work so that you can continue to deliver really good stuff for them. It also means finding resources in other places that are oftentimes thought about from artists. For example, arts grants. With the American Rescue Plan, President Biden just authorized hundreds of millions of dollars to go to arts. And that means writing grants. It means money to like create new works of art and projects. It means money just to fund artists to survive. Like, figure out how to get access to that money based on the organizations available in your area. Many other countries offer this as well. Like, just figure out like, what do I need to do? Do I need to work with a fiscal sponsor, like an accredited NGO or nonprofit, so that I can receive those grants? And if so, how do I develop those relationships? Maybe think about like sponsorships, like business investments or corporate partners who want to leverage your audience for their products. You can create a genuine partnership or relationship in a way that gets you capital. Could be crowdfunding. Maybe it's thinking about your work in other kinds of ways, like work for hire, like tutoring, consulting, etc. Again, no matter what, like your revenue and the resources you have needs to have a sustainability mindset, and it needs to be a practice. How can I make these things last in a way so I don't have to worry about it in the future? You want to create those assets so that you can continue making art and not struggle to survive. I hate this idea of like, starving artist mentality, because artists shouldn't be starving. You don't make your best work when you're hungry. You make your best work when you have all your needs fulfilled, so you could focus on the most important things around expression and creativity. And so let's get out of that mindset and think like, how can I be a thriving artist so I can continue to make my best work? When we talk about the map that you take on a journey, like that should also be revisited. So again, think about your success in really important ways. Again, I oftentimes tell people you should have smarter goals that are specific, measurable, attainable. They should be relevant to your situation, time-bound, but have a very specific time when you would like to accomplish them. Involve everyone on your team. That's that relationship piece. And they should be revisited often. You want goals that you're constantly looking at, or that could serve as those mile markers so that you know if you're on track or not when it comes to your career. If you deviate from the course, if you're getting further from that mountain, you'll know because you set up mile markers in advance, like, oh, I know I'm on track because a year from now, this is where I'm going to be in terms of like the art I made or the income I'm generating from my art. You really want to avoid those vanity metrics because those are detours. Social media is a useful tool for engaging with audiences, but it's very bad because it's a huge time suck, and it's an attention suck as well, because we start thinking like, am I getting likes? Am I getting followers? Like, that's part of the puzzle, but it shouldn't be the puzzle. And oftentimes artists fall into this trap where they spend most of their art cultivating things that aren't necessarily related to their art. It might be tangentially related, but we have to think, time and money, is it getting me closer to that mountain? So go for love instead of like likes. Go for, ways of cultivating the audience in a way that matters. Again, the renter versus owner mindset. A renter uses platforms that are owned by somebody else. If all of your assets, all your audiences are on social media like TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, etc. Imagine if those social media companies went bankrupt, like MySpace.com or Friendster did. What would happen? How would you reach those audiences? You don't own those lists. You don't own those relationships. Find a way to shift those things into an owned asset, like developing an email list or a contact list where you're constantly in touch with people. Maybe you have their phone numbers, you could text them. There are other ways of like having ownership. When it comes to your map, you want to follow the plan by having a daily practice. Again, show up even if you don't feel inspired. Even if you don't feel like driving closer to the mountain or walking towards that mountain, like show up on a regular basis. If you want to have an arts career, you have to start treating it like a job. If you want to have an arts business, you need to treat it like a business investment. And that means showing up to work on a regular basis and not making excuses for that. You want to minimize anything that takes you away from that work. And of course, self-care is not included in that list. It doesn't take you away from the work. It helps sustain you. Relationships are important, but showing up and doing the work is also part of the work too. And if you get lost, have a resource for getting directions. You should have, like, in the same way that you probably use Google Maps if you go somewhere now, or turn-by-turn navigation, you should probably have someone in your corner who could provide a little bit of counseling, who could speak wisdom into your career to provide you directions when you do get lost. And if you are ultimately like off track, you can always go back to your map. What is that plan? What is that plan that you've set for yourself and how to get to your destination? It doesn't need to be altered, but whatever it needs, like, you could be thinking ultimately about that destination. You could also think of this as like fitness or as education, because like if you want to say get in shape, you have to have a plan. And that means showing up consistently at the gym. It means having discipline by having the right kind of diet so that you can meet your goals. One of the biggest differences made in the success or failure of a diet is not even in the like choosing a certain diet, like, oh, I'm going to be pescatarian, or I'm going to be vegan, or something like that, or I'm going to avoid fried foods. Oftentimes, what makes the difference when it comes to health experts, they say it's tracking. So like making a food journal, tracking your calories, that makes a bigger difference than anything, because all of a sudden, everything that you do, everything that you consume is going through that mindset. Same thing goes for your arts career. If you start tracking your time and your investments in your career, thinking about how you spend that time, you could start saying, wait, is this actually serving my goal or not? Is it actually doing the thing that I'm seeking? And finally, you want to improve that itinerary, your schedule. You should schedule in success. You should plan for it by having those long-term and short-term goals. And you should articulate what success looks like for yourself. Where do you want to be a month from now, 6 months, a year, 5 years, 10 years? Again, going back to that first question I asked, what kind of impact are you seeking to make? And how will you measure that impact? How will you know if you're on track? Scheduling that in advance is super helpful, because then you can see if you're on track. You can use that map. You should create a working schedule and protect that time. Again, create that daily practice of creation. And then to be sustainable, you want to build in that time for complete wellness, physical health, mental health, emotional health. You want to take care of yourself so that you can take care of yourself and others. So build in that time for like all those aspects that are contributing to this. And think, like, at the end of the day, it's about quality, not necessarily just quantity of time. You might say like, oh, I spent 10 hours working on my art today. What was it? Focus time that it was actually things that are building like towards your goal? Or is it just like piddling around on social media or playing around with a new website design? Like, focus on that quality and those metrics you care about. And then again, consistency matters, just like showing up at the gym on a regular basis and making good food choices. If you want to get in shape, when it comes to your art, you need to make sure that you're showing up on a regular basis. I want to close out with this particular story because I think it's one of my favorite when it comes to like thinking about maps, thinking about destinations and that sort of thing. And it comes from this idea of a paper town. Now, back in the day, over hundreds of years ago, when cartographers relied on their maps of the world, they would create something called a paper town. It was a fake destination somewhere located on a map, because other cartographers were looking at their work. But if they copied your work and they had your fake town on their map, well, you could be assured that you now have the proof to go after them and say, like, you stole my work. Well, 1938, the General Drafting Company publishes a map of upstate New York. At the foothill of the Catskill Mountains, at the intersection of two dirt roads, they place this little town there. And they call it Agloe. And of course, Agloe, it's a paper town. It doesn't exist. Well, a couple of decades later, Rand McNally publishes their map of upstate New York, and on it was Agloe. So of course, the smaller publishing company gets really excited. They call them up and say, hey, we're going to sue you. You stole our work. That's a paper town. And Rand McNally's like, no, it's totally real. We wouldn't do that. But they decided to resolve this by driving to this intersection in the middle of nowhere. And what did they find? They found a town. You see, people kept driving to this destination because they expected a place to be there. It was on their map. And one day, some guy just decided to build it. And in its the height of its time, they had like multiple houses, a gas station, a general store, and so on. The point of the story, though, is that like oftentimes we have assumptions about our maps. We have assumptions about our world. We think the maps are created basically based on the world around us, that there's a river, there's a street, there's a mountain, there's our map. It reflects our world. But a much more fascinating idea, and this is an idea specifically for you, the artist, is to think about how you can literally change the world by changing the process in which you map it. If you change the process in which you chase your arts career, to make it more sustainable, to focus on impact first, well, oftentimes you can literally change what that world looks like. So change the process of mapping it, and that's how you can make a lasting impact.